Welcome back to Beyond Four Walls, Conversations on Affordable Housing. I'm David Dworkin, President and CEO of the National Housing Conference, the nation's oldest and broadest affordable housing coalition. I'm joined today by Bob Pinnegar, President and CEO of the National Apartment Association, the leading voice and premier resource for the rental housing industry. Bob leads a nationwide network of industry professionals, researchers, and local affiliates, spearheading advocacy and public policy efforts, building strategic partnerships, and overseeing the development of innovative resources and education for the rental housing community. With more than 20 years of experience in the apartment industry and a deep background in public policy, Bob brings a unique perspective to the organization. Prior to NAA, Bob served as executive director and chief lobbyist of the San Diego County Apartment Association. I was just in San Diego. Welcome, Bob. I'm excited to talk with you today.
I'm glad to be on the show. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. So, housing has been in the news just a little bit recently.
It is having its 15 minutes.
Rental housing in particular. Some of us have been talking about it for a long time. It's nice that other people caught on, but tell me a little bit about the rental market and what your members are experiencing, and we're going to get into what we need to do. But, I think it's really important to understand what's happening on the ground.
Right now, we're still going through uncertain economic times. The costs of operating have been increasing tremendously, along with, when interest rates went up, that had a dramatic impact on the bottom line of many properties across the country.
They went up a lot, and they went up very quickly.
Very quickly, yeah. And there were, if you were locked into a fixed rate mortgage, you had some time. If you weren't, then you had to react very quickly. But then also the cyclical nature of the way financing is in this industry is that you're usually on a 5 to 10 year window for your refinancing. So as we go through this process, there are still operators that are coming up on that refinancing window, and how do they deal with it? Do they put money back into the property? Do they bring on mezzanine financing, which has its own costs associated with it? And so there's a lot of uncertainty there, and people are being very cautious. We also are aware of looking at what's happening out there in the market itself. George, our head of research in the organization, did a presentation that was really interesting, looking at, for example, the first-time student that's out of college. So your major costs that you're going to have are going to be your rent, it's going to be your student loans, and it is going to be your car loan, because getting out, you need that, that first car, whether it's a new car, whether it's an old car. And he went to look at the increase in the cost of cars over the last 25 years. And there's been a substantial increase. And then looking at car loans for new cars, it's not unusual for people to be paying $1,000 a month for a car payment. And we're looking at what's happening with regards to the bad debt in that space, because we're looking at that as sort of a foreshadowing of what's going to happen with the larger economy. We had some good news today with regards to job growth,
Sure,
which was welcome news. But as we go through this year, we're hoping that we see the economy improve. We're hoping that we see absorption pick up. I'm optimistic in saying that as we get into 2027, I think we're going to see an improved year. I think that we will begin to see rent growth again. I don't think it will be the rent growth that we have seen previous to that. I think it's going to be much more moderated. And I am also talking with developers out there, whereas as inflation began to rise, as interest rates began to go up, there was sort of the phases of mourning as their business model began to fall apart. But in having conversations with those people that have been smart, that have been able to hold on, that have repurposed their people so they didn't lose that institutional knowledge, they're beginning to look out there for opportunities. So we had the beginnings of the green shoots. I think that we're not going to see that construction begin meaningfully until probably late 27 into early 28. Then we'll begin to see deliveries probably in 28, late 28, early 29. But those are in parts of the country where there's relatively few barriers to new construction. In a place like California, where it can take 4 years to go through the entitlement process to begin building, it's going to take much longer for California to begin to see rental housing come back online as a result of the economic uncertainty we've experienced.
So we definitely have talked a lot about California in the past, and obviously, the book Abundance that Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson wrote focuses on California. It's kind of the poster child of bad housing policy, although they've made a lot of efforts to try to address that recently. But there are other states, too, that struggle with this. Tell me a little bit about that. I mean, who are the other states that when you look at your members, and I'll take a quick step back to say, we're going to have like 4 conversations here. We're going to talk about owners and operators who are sometimes the same people and sometimes aren't, the builders and the renters, the tenants.
Mm-hmm.
And they're all experiencing different pain points in the housing market that we're in.
Yeah. And looking at other challenging states, you just look at the entirety of the West Coast. There's challenges there. We have challenges as we look at the Eastern Seaboard. There's challenges in Illinois. And so those are areas that we're paying attention to. I mean, in the Southeast, relatively few barriers to new construction. As a result, that's where a lot of the development had occurred. And that's also where we saw rents begin to drop significantly. And also at the same time as that was going on, the whole concept of synthetic fraud, identity theft began to really blossom in an area like Atlanta. And that has had an impact on operators as well.
How so?
Well, it's everything from a whole synthetic identification to I'm going to go online and I'm going to get pay stubs that are not, in fact, what I actually make. And the challenge for the industry is those operators that have begun to centralize operations, so centralize the screening process and reviewing things, I think they were the first to be able to identify the problem. And so they're now going to third-party groups to assist them in looking at the materials that come in and evaluating them and reviewing them to make sure they are in fact authentic. If you're still working in a decentralized model, and given the fact that of the 43 million rental units in this country, the largest operator has 1 million rental units. So it is a very diversified ownership operations. And as you said, some owners are owners and operators, some are not. I think that there is a significant impact out there of identity theft it's beginning to spread across the country. Is an issue here in D.C. It's beginning to pop up in other markets across the country and even onto the West Coast.
And this is a case where somebody shows up as a tenant, they have a fake identity, fake background, they get into the unit, I'm guessing they don't pay rent, and then by the time you get them out, you've eaten that cost. The unit's been occupied by somebody who's basically making plenty of money by not paying anything, and that's going to come back to everybody else who's living in that unit who are actually real people.
It comes back in a number of ways. I mean, if you think about it, for every month of lost rent, you've lost 8% of your income. And in an industry like ours, where it's a relatively small margin, where 89 cents of every dollar pays for the mortgage, it pays taxes, it pays employees, it puts money aside for the maintenance of the property, capital improvements, you don't need to lose many months, and it's a significant impact. That impacts the operation of the property. That also impacts the consumer themselves, because you take a risk when you rent a unit to anybody that comes in the door. And so as you have more challenges from the standpoint of the identity theft issue, you're going to become more conservative in your screening criteria, which means those people that may have been marginal before will not qualify, because you're simply trying to protect the business so it can run and operate. So there is a downstream impact that has a dramatic impact on especially people that are lower on the income scale, that may have less than stellar credit. Those are real impacts.
So let's talk about the big issue of the day, which is housing supply. And there are wide estimates of how many units we're short. I usually go with 3 million, but I always make a point of saying I don't really care, because if it's at least 1 million, and I'm absolutely positive it is, let's build 1 million new units and we can talk about how many more we need to build. But why don't we start with just building 1 million units and we'll go from there. But we haven't been. And I think historically, we're around 1.3 combined, single and multi. And looking back, that was kind of the mark where we've been at in the past, but it doesn't account for the deep hole we've dug. And so just getting back to some semblance of normal doesn't do anything to close that gap that we've created. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen housing prices go up so much. The law of supply and demand is never repealed. Give me a little bit of a sense of how we got into this hole from the perspective of building more apartments, and then really importantly, how are we getting out of it?
Stepping back in the past and looking at it, if you turn back the clock, apartments as we see them today did not exist 25, 30 years ago.
How's that?
Well, instead of having the larger properties we have today that actually have efficiency and economies of scale, so they're able to run more effectively, a lot of the development that was done out there was smaller developers that were building either a duplex, a triplex, a fourplex, a six-pack, an eight-pack was the terminology that used to be used. And they were building these things and selling them to individuals. And that was going to be the retirement for the couple that was buying the apartment building. As time went on, some of those became functionally obsolete. They were, those parcels were gathered up. But that was a different sort of development. Even ownership was very different. And I think that there were some decisions that were made. I mean, I came from San Diego, and I studied this in college. When the city went in and took some parts of the city and decided they were going to zone them for multifamily and single-family zones, they did it in the wrong way.
What's that?
They allowed communities that were very small to be built, so there was not adequate parking as you went from a one-car family to a two-car family, and it created a lot of resentment amongst the community, the homeowners in the community. It was not called Not in My Backyard at that point in time, but I was going down to city council meetings when they were downzoning entire tracts of the city. And from the standpoint of, as new developments were being built, the people in the older parts of the city wanted to have parks and schools and everything on the same par as these new areas that were being developed. And they used that as a way to downzone many parts of the city. It's funny going back to San Diego now after being gone for more than a decade and a half. Those same people who were arguing against density are now in favor of density. Mm-hmm. So we've turned the corner, but still we have a challenge that we just don't have enough property zoned for multifamily development. And as a result, the property that is out there is very expensive. And if you have large, lengthy approval processes that can be slowed down, or you can hold a property hostage, that impacts it. If the council members want to exact a certain amount of things for their area, I've been in council meetings and board of supervisor meetings where we've all seen it, where a developer has to sit there and say, okay, how much can I actually give out before I have to walk away from this whole process? All that adds more to the cost of housing.
And just the time value of money.
Yeah.
I mean, to kill a deal, you don't actually have to kill it. You just have to delay it to the point where it's losing money before they even stick a shovel in the ground.
We've done some research. We should be updating it. But we went and looked at a number of communities. I think it was like 50 communities across the country. And the first phase of it, we looked at 4 different jurisdictions. And so we looked at New York City, we looked at San Diego, we looked at a community in Florida, and I want to say we looked at Phoenix. Mm-hmm. So because of the weaponization of the environmental laws in California, I was amazed that San Diego was the most difficult of those 4 jurisdictions to be able to develop in. Now, I would have said New York City would be the worst, but it was not the worst. Mm-hmm. Then as we went through the larger study, where we looked at all these different jurisdictions, there were some definite themes with regards to the development process and the approval process directly correlating to how friendly or how unfriendly the jurisdiction was to new housing.
Yep. One of the things I always say is that, if you don't want affordable housing in your backyard, you are going to end up with homeless people in your front yard. And, I used to say you can go to Los Angeles and San Francisco and see what that looks like. But the reality is you can go anywhere in the country and see what that looks like. And we've got affordable housing shortages in cities like Des Moines and Boise, Idaho, And in Nebraska, Lincoln, Nebraska, I mean, when we have a housing crisis in Lincoln, Nebraska, we have a housing crisis everywhere in this country.
Yeah. It's not just in the big cities anymore. It is everywhere.
Yeah, and not to mention Nashville. And this is also one of the problems, I think, is it sometimes will come with new jobs. And you'll have a big influx of new jobs like they got in Nashville, and yet you have a housing approach that hasn't changed at all. And everybody's shocked when housing prices shoot up, and the value of those jobs ends up on the community becoming quite a mixed bag. And something great has turned into something really complicated and not so great. And we have to think about that.
Yeah, there really are consequences. I was at one of our conferences. It was a number of years ago. It was a board meeting. And this is, I don't know if you remember the ghost fire in Oakland, where the warehouse, it was an artist loft sort of environment, caught on fire. A number of people lost their lives. And this was after the fire, and I was having a conversation with somebody in one of the shops, and there were no customers for her. She had time to talk, and I had time to talk. Yeah. And she was explaining to me that she was born and raised in San Francisco, yet she lived in one of those lofts in Oakland. And as we had more conversation, I was asking her about how safe she feels in the neighborhood around there. And she said she could use public transportation, but because of the hours that she has in her job, she drives. And so she talked about the cost of driving and the traffic and all those issues. But then she went on to talk about the mom and pop businesses, the dry cleaner, the small grocery stores, how they were closing because they could not afford to pay much above minimum wage.
Yeah.
And if you are going to get paid minimum wage, why would you commute into the city of San Francisco? Because you're not going to find any housing.
That's right.
And so then you have that economic impact. And then a year later, I'm in New York and having a conversation with a group of people, and they're lamenting the loss of the small mom and pop businesses, and they don't understand why. And I start asking them questions, and it's the same issue there. Well, that is happening in cities all across our country.
I will note for the record that in the Bay Area, if you're going to build new housing, you could pay $125,000 per unit or more in a development fee, impact fee that is does nothing but get you to permission to stick your first shovel in the ground, but not your permit to do so. So you're really starting with a huge deficit, and that money's coming from somewhere. It's either going to come from higher rents or it's going to come from plugging in more subsidies that get taken from something else. It's a pretty simple math.
And for the light-tech developers that are putting together these incredibly complex stacks of funding and financing, just the challenges of the reporting associated with all of this. There was a affordable housing provider out in California, and having a conversation with him, he was explaining that he has a property that has such a complex funding stack, and the reporting requirements are so difficult that it's pretty much a full-time employee in the office that handles that. If you think about the cost of that, the system is broken, and something has to be done radically to fix it.
Well, yes, totally. And I think what we have is, the problem is not new jobs. The problem is bad planning. And I'm a big believer, and I say this a lot when I'm out in the field, is the missing factor in these zoning board meetings is the employers. Those are the guys who need to be in the meeting, because you're always going to have a dozen angry local residents who like things just the way they are. That's human nature. I get that. The problem is that these zoning commissioners are listening to them and not anybody else. And the people not in the room are often the people who are getting hurt the most. And a lot of times those are employers who I think zoning board members would probably be happy to listen to if they were.
If they were in the room. It's, if you look at the environmental impact review process in many parts of the country, it has been love it or hate it, because there's a lot of developers that hate the process, but it has had an impact on the environment in a positive way. You could make that argument.
Right.
Given that housing is such an integral part of every community, shouldn't we be looking at some sort of approach like that? If every time a decision was made, be it a city council decision, what is the impact on housing? Is this going to benefit the citizens that are living in the communities? Is this going to have a negative impact on the citizens in the communities? It's something I've talked about over the years. I don't have the brain power to figure out how to do that. But if we had that kind of approach, it would provide some objective information into those conversations that occur at a zoning meeting or at a city council meeting or at a board of supervisors meeting, to try to bring that perspective of those people who aren't there because they're busy trying to make ends meet and they have jobs and they can't be at those meetings.
So we have this underinvestment that we've seen and a shortage of housing. We have the law of supply and demand, and we've had rents increasing pretty significantly in a lot of places. That has then spurred a whole nother debate around rent controls and tenant protections. Help me understand that from your perspective. What's going on with the high rents? What are we seeing now? And, how do we manage that?
Coming out of COVID, we had a very unique situation. You had years of household formation that was really stagnated, that hit very quickly. Something that I didn't really cross my mind, didn't realize till I was having a conversation with an operator and talking about the experience with their residents, and saying for those people who had a roommate because it was easier to make ends meet, this is somebody you saw in passing. You spent a year with them.
Some cases that was your spouse.
Yes, some cases, yeah.
My wife is a couples counselor, and I will tell you that we're very embarrassed by the fact that her practice tripled during the pandemic.
I'm not surprised. So whether it was a family breaking up as a result of that, or whether it was a roommate situation where they wanted to either go off on their own, so you started to see an increase in studios and single-family homes. And you also had people that were moving from one place to the other, going to jurisdictions that really didn't have the housing supply there. The infrastructure was not there. I mean, has been a huge issue. At the same time, you saw a lot of increasing costs, as I had mentioned before, down in Florida where everybody was moving to. I have members down there that have told me that they've seen like a 2,600% increase in their insurance if they can get it. And then tied to the insurance, for many people I've talked to, is that there are specific capital improvement projects that they had to complete in order to just get insurance if they could get it at any cost. Those are things that aren't talked about a lot, but that has impacted the market. And as we go into this election cycle, housing affordability is definitely an issue out there. We are seeing a proliferation of policies like rent control and other things that are very negative to the industry that are going to scare away capital. And so we need all the capital we can out there to solve this problem. Because as you said, whether it's 1 million units or, the study we did that called for 4.3 by 2030 something, and that's just to maintain this current supply-demand imbalance, we're going to need to build all types of rental housing. And it is, I would love to say that it was easy. I was at an NMHC meeting.
National Multifamily Housing Council.
Yes, sorry, going into acronyms.
Who you work, that's okay. Well, listen, my listeners love going deep into the weeds, so you should never stop doing that. But every now and then I may throw in an explanation of an acronym for the 10% of members who don't actually go deep into the weeds, but are happy to do so if they know what we're talking about.
Okay. Great. So it was an interesting conversation. So it was Sharon Wilson-Janot, who's the current CEO, was her predecessor, was there and had the meeting. And he asked developers to raise their hands who could develop, started out at 100% of median area income. All the hands are up 25 years ago. Then started going down. Got to the point where it was like there were hands that were still up talking about 60%. Then today, and started at the low end and went up. And that was a very stark reality for anybody who was in the room. And yes, we are building Class A product. And, the Minneapolis Fed did some research talking about the filtering that occurs. So for every 100 units of Class A product you build, it opens up 70 units that are up and down the food chain within the Class A, Class B, Class C properties. But the fact that because of the current environment we have, prohibits developers from building to all price points, that's something we should be very concerned about, because we need to not just build Class A product, we need to build product for a number of price points if we're going to solve this problem.
Yeah. And a number of sizes. You talked a little bit about small multifamily. It's very different building a apartment building that has 400 units from one that has 40, or not to mention 10. But tell me, understand, what are the issues that your members on the small end are facing, both in terms of their direct financing and operating costs, but also the role that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac play and don't play in that space as investors?
Yeah, as investors, when you get to the smaller end of the spectrum, insurance is a huge issue because, and some states more than others, but an older product, which tends to be smaller, is going to be more difficult to insure. It's going to have an infrastructure that is likely more expensive to maintain than something that is newer. And it's not, at this point in time, looking at what's happening out there with transactions, the older stock, and almost, 60% of the nation's housing stock was built before the 80s. And that stock is not as attractive to investors right now. And so as a result of that, that's a stock out there that is still largely operated by individuals who purchased it either as their investment strategy or generational wealth, and they're largely operating it themselves. And so they're trying to, on the weekends, coming from an association out in California where it truly does have everything from an individual operator all the way up to the very large operators. You do have the person that comes in. We would come into the office, because this is back in the days where you got a pad of rental forms, and they would be cleaning the leaves out of the gutters the day before. They'll come on Sunday. They come in on Monday towards the end of the day to pick up their stuff. And they're also the group that has to constantly be educated on the changing complexity of laws. When I'm having conversations with policymakers and we're talking about policies and we're talking about complexity, I'm always trying to stress to them that the majority of this industry is owned by individuals. And so we need to look at how do we make things as simple and straightforward as possible to ensure that they're going to be able to comply and operate their properties lawfully and efficiently.
What is the breakdown between institutional investors and small family investors? Or
there's an easy break if you look at the 1 to 4 unit category. That's about, the last time I looked at those numbers, we're probably talking about 22 million units, maybe 23 million.
Which is like what percent of the
it's like
rental
50,
units
it's
out
50
there?
some percent. So you have
half.
about 43 million units in this country.
Okay.
And if you're looking at the institutional investor is going to skew largely towards properties 100 unit plus. Really, their sweet spot is 250 units plus because of the operational efficiencies, because these are going to tend to be newer properties. Between that 100 units and 5 unit buildings, that's where you have individuals. So maybe it's somebody who had a duplex and they maybe bought something else and they've traded up. And so maybe they have a 10 or 12 or a 15 or 20 unit building. Then you also have the high net worth individuals that purchase in this space. Then you have partnerships. I mean,
Right.
It's not unusual for groups out there to be pooling together investors to put together a group that's going to buy property, and they're going to buy that property and hold it for X amount of years. And then at the end of that period of time, they're going to sell it. And then the profits go back to the individuals who invested into the endeavor.
So you talked a lot about insurance, and it's come up a couple times, and this is something we're very active in. We've created a insurance collaborative because we just have not been successful in coming up with policy response that everybody can agree to. And in this environment that we live in today, if you can't get broad agreement, it's not happening. So you just have a lot of people talking and nobody doing anything. And what we're trying to do is come up with what is the largest common denominator when it comes to solutions here. Help me and us understand better, what are the pain points, both in cost and availability, that apartment owners and operators are seeing? And we're going to separate the property insurance from the casualty insurance because they're two different things and come with a different set of issues, but they are both driving costs and rents.
Yeah. Clarity around what can be done from the standpoint of capital improvements to the asset to be able to mitigate higher insurance rates. I think it's also a process of how can you, and this is something that we've had a lot of conversations about with our members, is you need to have conversations with your brokers well in advance of your renewal and try to get to those underwriters to understand what are the factors that they're considering. And if there was broader awareness of that to allow the industry to mitigate the risk to a greater degree, I think we could have some relief. I don't think that's the magic bullet. I don't know that there is one solution, not that it's come apparent to me. I mean, I've read about proposals that the government should come in and become that insurer and then parse out the risk and resell it to the other insurance companies. At this point, I don't see the desire of Congress to move in that direction.
And I think the insurance industry is not happy about that. And when you look at the National Flood Insurance Program, I don't know that we actually have much of a track record in doing that well. We definitely need to figure this thing out. But what are you guys seeing and how are they experiencing this?
Well, and before we move on to that, it was an interesting, I was going to a conference and I got delayed. And so I think it was like midnight and I was standing there and an insurance executive, very chatty, very, very awake, more than I was, started to talk. And I was asking him about the insurance market and what were the challenges going on. And he was interesting, his perspective, is he said, look, the insurance industry invests in bonds and they invest in commercial real estate. So bonds are ready cash that can be accessed. When interest rates began to go up, the value of the bonds went down. And they own office buildings. As office buildings began to empty out, the value of the buildings began to fall. The ability to go in and borrow against those and tap into that equity, that was severely constrained. And that's also been a factor, and I think still is to a certain degree, of why we're seeing the insurance rates go up as they have, is because there was no other choice. And I was at a Urban Land Institute multifamily council meeting, and there was a brokerage firm that came in and they did a presentation and they were explaining that as interest rates increase, traditionally, outside capital comes in to invest because as the insurance rates increase, the return increases. But because of the continued uncertainty about environmental risk, those dollars are not coming in the numbers that they had traditionally. And so mitigating environmental risk is also going to be a part of the solution.
And how are you defining environmental risk?
If you're in Florida, there's issues around hurricanes.
Sure.
If you are in areas where you have tornadoes, so it's like, how do you deal with these things?
Catastrophic weather events.
That are happening with increasing frequency.
Quite a bit of increasing frequency. There's really, I mean, I don't know what a 500 or 100-year storm is anymore, because it seems like we're having them every 3 or 4 years.
It used to be a 100-year storm was a big thing. Now a 500-year storm is a big thing.
Yeah.
And the wildfires in California.
Yeah. And I was in Altadena a few months ago, and it takes your breath away. It's tragic. And no one had a model to insure or invest, and with that as a possibility. And yet we've seen it in Hawaii and in California and who knows where else. We certainly never thought, I never thought we'd see hurricane damage in Asheville, North Carolina.
Yeah, because the people that were going to the mountains saying they were going to be safe, and they weren't. I mean, and if you look at, there was, this was about the time that the fires were occurring in Altadena, and they were looking at the recovery. And I want to say it was a New York Times article, and it was interesting. It was a reporter, so there were probably 6 or 7 years before that, there was a significant fire up in Sonoma County. So this is Northern California, that went into a number of areas. It went into an area that was more affluent. And so this was a area that was up in the hills, had great views. And it also went into an area that was down in the lower land that were more modest homes. And the reporter coming back in and looking at those communities, the product that was in the lower lands that were more modest homes, there were developers that were able to come in with sort of a piecemeal approach. What do you want from this plan or that plan? And that community had been largely rebuilt. The community that was more affluent, that was up in the hills, that had more complex terrain, that required architects to be more involved, that area had not recovered. And
Yeah.
I do worry with all of these weather events that are happening, how that continues to just add more pressure to the housing affordability across the country.
I'm certain it will. I mean, again, it's really pretty simple math. So Congress has been increasingly engaged in this. I think part of the reason is that this crisis has really gone out of the coast and permeated the country now. And so much more diverse set of members are looking at it. And there's been some there's a lot of unprecedented things happening in the last year. It's the ultimate cliche. I'm tired of using the word unprecedented, but thankfully, one of the unprecedented things is the extent to which Republicans and Democrats have been working together on housing. There's no magic wand here, but there are two pieces of legislation that are going to definitely contribute, in one sense, to some policy solutions. But I think even more important is restoring the principle and the experience of Republicans and Democrats working together to actually pass legislation. So there are two bills out there. There's the Road to Housing Act, which is the Senate bill, and the Housing for the 21st Century Act, which is the House bill. I want to talk a little bit about what's in those bills that you think is most important. And then the second piece of it is, how are we going to get those reconciled into something that goes to the president? Because as anybody who's worked on the Hill knows, if you're in the House, the one thing Democrats and Republicans agree on is the enemy is the Senate, and vice versa. So we are seeing that in real time. It's been a while since people had to face that, but now people are talking past each other, but isn't it because they're Democrats and Republicans? And they do both recognize, meaning both sides in the leadership, that, oh, wow, we need to deal with this. And I think they're going to. But let's talk about Road to Housing. This is the Senate bill that Senator Scott, chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, and the ranking member, Elizabeth Warren, have put together with amazing bipartisan support.
Mm-hmm. There's some great pieces of legislation in that bill. And when we were having at your conference, we were having the conversation and very hopeful and optimistic they were going to move through. Previously, it was stalled, but now we're back again. And if you had 2 years ago, we talked about the potential for this to happen, it would have been quite unlikely. There's a number of things in the legislation, in both pieces of legislation, that we're very supportive of. I think what you said, as we get through the process of what the final bill will be, I think that's the time to really take a much closer look, because what is going to be possible to get through both houses. I think that we're getting past that partisan, I do not want to give this person or that person any sort of a acknowledgement in their legislation. So I think that as we go through this process, as it plays out, I think that then we'll be able to look at the pieces of legislation.
Yeah, we have an incredibly broad coalition, everybody from tenant rights groups to groups like yours and everybody in between.
You have a job that is probably more difficult than mine.
So it is and it isn't. Everybody thinks it is, which is a big help for me. But the dirty little secret is people agree with each other a lot more than they think. And if you're focused on what they agree on instead of what they don't,
Bring people to the table.
You can bring people together. And also, I have the luxury of using a big umbrella rather than a big tent. And if you're the big tent within an industry of competitors, that's a hard needle to thread sometimes. When you're a big umbrella that everybody recognizes, they're never going to agree on everything. And they're okay with a consent model rather than consensus, where it's like, okay, I don't like that, but I understand why you're supporting it, and I'm going to take a pass. It's not my turn under the umbrella, but I want the next one. And you're not presenting an existential threat to your members. Surprised you can actually get stuff done. So that's really worked for us. I think that, again, the narrower your coalition, the harder that is.
Yeah.
And the more passionate and the higher the expectations of members are. And that's something that groups like yours have to deal with every day, as I don't have to tell you that. One of the things nobody gets out of here without answering, it's my favorite question for our guest, and it is, what is the most interesting and important fact about you that has nothing to do with your work?
God, interesting question. I think I was lucky enough to be born at a time in California when people were working together more than they were tearing themselves apart.
Mm-hmm.
And it has provided a perspective, not just in my professional career, but throughout the entirety of my life. And it's something that I try to remember all the time, especially in a town like this where there's a lot of strong personalities and everybody came here with the intention that they were going to do good.
Mm-hmm.
The person across the table might not agree with that, but that's their perspective. But just trying to go back to a time was, how do we bring people together? If I could not build consensus and have some level of optimism that things are going to be better, I couldn't do my job.
How do you detach from your job? What's your happy place?
On the weekend, when I can take my phone and put it on my dresser and not come back to it for at least 12 hours.
There you go.
I mean, detaching from social media and all of that, that's the best time I can have.
Okay.
That's why I'm not so excited about American Airlines offering free Wi-Fi on the plane now. So now I am not connected when I'm in the air anymore.
No excuse now when you're in the air.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being with us. And I always enjoy these opportunities to get to know folks better. And the work you do is so important. And, you know, your members are on the very front line of the housing crisis. And we're going to have to figure this out, because if we're not, we're going to be talking about it for a long time. It's going to get a lot worse.
Yeah, it's going to get worse.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Beyond Four Walls. You can visit the National Housing Conference at nhc.org. There you can learn more about affordable housing policies, affordability challenges throughout the nation on our Paycheck to Paycheck database, and explore membership in NHC for you or your organization. We appreciate your interest and look forward to working with you in the future. Until next time, I'm David Dworkin, NHC's President and CEO, wishing you a great day.
This podcast was edited by Resonate Recordings.